Hey, I'm Brian Van, SportbikeTrackYou.com. Today we're going to break down the driven captive axle block adjuster install on our 2022 Yamaha R7 STG project bike. Okay, let's quickly break down the tools that we used to install the driven captive axle block spacers. I've got two 12mm wrenches, 17mm wrench, got a 5mm T-handle, a little short stubby Phillips screwdriver, got a 1/2-inch ratchet. I have a 1/2-inch torque wrench, right? It needs to be able to go to at least 77 foot-pounds. I used a rubber mallet, and we used a steel ruler to measure the chain slack. The socket size for the axle nut. Don't hate me. I used a standard socket. It's 1 1/16", which would translate to basically 27mm, which I don't have. For whatever reason, I don't have a 27mm socket. I may get one. Right, so if you have 1 1/16", you could use that. If not, you're going to need a 27mm. Okay, step one for the install, we need to remove our axle nut. You'll note that I'm using a pit bull rear stand with a pit crew tire wedge that supports the rear tire. Just makes the job a little easier. That's not something you have to have, but if you do, it definitely makes the job easier. I push the axle partially through, and I'm going to grab it here by that axle block and then pull it out. Next up, we're going to get our two 12mm wrenches. And we're going to go ahead and break loose the jam nuts. Remember, with all your OEM stuff, I always tell you guys this: never discard, always keep all the OEM fasteners and pieces you remove from the bike, because you never know when you may need them down the road. All right. The driven captive axle block adjusters. What I want to point out here is they are two different sizes, okay? The shorter of the two is going to go on the right side of the bike, the brake side, and the longer of the two fits over here on the clutch side of the motorcycle. It's very important that the adjuster arrow faces up. I'm going to thread this on part way. And you'll note, if you look at the swing arm here, this clearly is the outer edge. You want to make sure that these cams, right, are set up in such a way that they're already partially engaged, still loose, right, so that you're going to be able to feed this in there, but they're engaged enough that there's no possibility of them rotating on here, okay, because they need to be held in place and then slide up the ramp. Like so. So I'm going to slide this one in. You know, if you really, this is a project bike, and I tell you guys, you know, oftentimes the stuff that you see us putting on, it may for whatever reason end up back off the bike. It's not because it's not a good part, it's just because we're moving in a different direction, doing something else. These fasteners here with these locks, I mean, you could put a little blue Loctite on it. Might not be a bad idea. Definitely don't put any Loctite on the adjuster. I'm just going to give this just a little tap. I want to make sure it's nice and flush against that swing arm. Just a rubber mallet there. Notice I didn't really strike it very hard at all. There is a torque spec that I saw included in the instructions of 12 foot-pounds for these. If you want to use a torque wrench, if you're more comfortable doing that, by all means, please do so. All right, once again, you want to make sure that's sitting flush against the swing arm. I use the rubber mallet to make sure that that's happening. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just by hand, I'm going to crank this back so that there's a slot on the inside of the swing arm. We want to make sure that the inner edge where the axle passes through is at least in line with that so we can get the axle to come back through it. You do need to reuse one of the OEM jam nuts, so we're just going to go ahead and just lightly thread that on there. Now we'll go over to the other side and we'll get that one rolling. This is not a very difficult project, right? I think this is something most riders are going to be able to tackle. You know, you need to have a stand, you need to have spools. Beyond that, the tools that we're using are pretty common. You want to make sure your arrow is facing up and that this portion is facing out to engage with the swing arm. A little tighter fit on this side. Just want to make sure those cams, you don't have one of them that's already too tight, so I loosened those up a little bit and then allowed that to jump in there. So that was already partially engaged. Okay, so now we'll get the rubber mallet out. Give this thing just a couple of taps to make sure we're up against that swing arm. Already sounds nice and solid. This is the spot where if you're more comfortable with the torque wrench, once again, 12 foot-pounds is what I saw on the instruction sheet that was included with these from Driven. You could also use some blue thread locker on these if you choose to. If you're going to use a thread locker, you need to make sure you move fast enough during the install so it's not setting up. I mean, you've got a reasonable amount of time to work with, so there's no need to really rush, but you don't want to walk away from the job for an hour and then come back to it. Give this just another tap. Sounds good and solid, so that's seated. These are available in multiple colors. That is typical Driven style. For the project bike here, they sent out black. Like everything Driven does, the quality is excellent. They're one of the only brands left that's really doing a lot of the colors. If you want to go ahead and see if you can get inside there, Lucas, and you can see what I'm talking about with that swing arm. You can see the inner edge of the swing arm. You just want to get that, you know, to begin with. Far enough back that you can get your axle to pass through. Now we're ready to put the axle back in. I've got a rag here that I soaked with some Maxima MPPL. What is that? That's kind of like a higher quality WD-40. You could use a little bit of grease here, whatever. Anytime you have your axle out, you know, especially if you're a street rider and it's not going to come out very often, take the opportunity to lube it a little bit. Just make sure that the next time when you go to remove it, it's going to come out. Especially if it's going to be in there for an extended period of time, you definitely want to make sure that you've got it lubricated. Come over to the other side. Go ahead and get the other axle block on. That started. There's a washer. It's a locking nut. Okay, now we're going to remove the Pitbull Pit Crew tire wedge. If you don't have this, it's not a big deal. I mean, you can just lift the wheel back up and slide the axle through. It's something I have in the toolbox. It's convenience. So I, of course, am going to use it. You're going to note now, oh, look at that. That's pretty loose, man. 100% not riding around like that. So what I'm going to do here, I don't want to get the axle too tight to where things won't slide, but I want to get right on the brink, like right about there. And we're going to come back here, start to draw the axle back, all the while paying attention to the axle block adjuster marks. Looks like that's about 6 lines back. Over the other side. The secret document that comes with your motorcycle is going to have the chain adjustment specifications as well as the axle nut torque specification. All right, so we're going to start there. 6 lines back, still pretty loose. Grab my flashlight so I can see what I'm doing. Over the other side. You want to make sure you keep this as even as possible. This bike is brand new, it hasn't been ridden yet. Completely stock. Okay, so I know what my axle torque spec is at 77 foot-pounds. I got a torque wrench ready to go. I got some tools here to measure it. Every bike's different. You know, when you go to torque the axle, it changes the chain slack. So it's really important that you don't measure it when the axle's loose and then not double check it after you've torqued your axle. So since this bike is obviously new to me, what I want to do is I want to torque this down a little bit, and I just want to see what kind of effect torquing the axle nut has on the chain slack. I've seen some bikes where when you go from loose to tight, it has a massive effect, and I've seen other bikes where it really doesn't do much. So let's find out where this R7 comes in. Yeah, it's still pretty loose, so we're going to continue adjusting that, and that didn't really look like it made much of a difference at all, so that's duly noted. You know, and once you know you've got the blocks, relatively even, you know, from there, you can see I'm kind of going in half turns here. All right, a little closer. Let's see where this takes us. You'll see that I'm putting in between the sprocket and the chain. That's just a stubby Phillips screwdriver. The reason I'm doing that is to make sure that it's pulling the axle all the way forward, thus putting tension on the adjuster blocks. That's still going to be too loose, so we're going to have to go a little further. The specification that I found in the secret document was measure from this point and it looks like we're probably a good about 10 mils too loose. Where these captive spacers, this is certainly more than a cosmetic mod, where these captive spacers are going to benefit you is when you're changing tires, right? Especially if you're a track day rider and you're doing frequent tire changes. The wheel adjusters on this bike are loose. So when you pull the axle, they can just fall right out of the swing arm, right? So they move all over the place. This is going to hold them there so they hold their spot, right? So the axle just passes right through and you make the tire change. It makes everything a little bit faster. Another half turn. I felt like it's really starting to tighten it up. And now we can see, I know where I'm at now. We'll go ahead and tighten the axle and see if that has any effect on it. It's funny how much drag this has compared to that Ninja 400 that we're racing in Moto America. I like right where that's at, right? Per the owner's manual for street bike, that is going to be completely in spec. So now what do we need to do next? Super important that you get these jam nuts tight. You know, I suppose you could use the washer back here if you didn't want to gall. So we're going to do that. That's a 17 millimeter wrench. This is a 12. You want to make sure when you're tightening the jam nut that you are holding the main nut. I do believe there was also a specification included for that in terms of torque. I think it was 12 foot-pounds. An axle adjuster jam nut is not a spot where I would use a torque wrench. But by all means, if you feel more comfortable doing that, 100%, that's what you should do. Backup wrench. Like so. Install the driven captive axle block adjusters are. Once again, we'll cover what is the benefit of this, right? Really, what are you doing? What this is going to do, because it's captive in the swing arm, is when you go to do your tire change, it's not going to allow the axle block to move around. Remember, it's threaded onto that nut, so it's held in place firmly. It makes the tire change much easier. It also looks a whole lot cooler than your OEM part does, right? This probably benefits most track day rider, maybe a club racer. There's a lot of street riders that they like to take as many OEM parts as possible and replace those on their bike with cool aftermarket parts, and this fits that bill as well. If you have any questions, leave those in the comment section of this video. I answer all that stuff myself, and I'm always here to make sure you get the same result from your next project we did ours.